All right, welcome to week 4, our final week together. And this week, we're really going to focus on the best practices for making the institutions and communities you're a part of more inclusive for LGBTQ individuals. So really bringing everything together that we've been talking about for the past 4 weeks. So our goals for today are to understand heteronormativity and cisnormativity and figuring out how you identify these types of structures, because it's really these things that we need to change in our communities. Review what those best practices are when it comes to LGBTQ inclusive programs, policy, and culture, and then hopefully identify the process by which you all, as participants, can enact institutional change back in your home communities. So we're going to start by really thinking about a helpful tool that we at Keshet use when we think about the framework for building inclusive communities. In our experience, in my experience, a lot of folks want to do the right thing. They would probably say that their communities are welcoming and respectful of everybody, but what's happening is they are blind to the ways in which they're still sending a message that being LGBTQ is wrong or not preferred or just hard, and makes it hard to navigate the institutions so that LGBTQ folks can really be their full selves in their Jewish space. So 2 key terms that we need to identify are heteronormativity and cisnormativity. Heteronormativity is this idea that being heterosexual or straight is the norm, it's the preferred way of being, it's the dominant way of being, and our structures are supported in this. So a heteronormative practice would be if you had a form for your religious school, for example, that had mother and father on it. That is a heteronormative practice because it assumes that everybody that would be enrolling a child in that religious school is headed by a mother and a father. When we know that there are plenty of families that are headed by a same-sex couple, a queer couple, or there are folks that don't fall into that family structure regardless of their sexual orientation and gender identity, right? They might be raised by their grandparents or by another family member. Similarly, cisnormativity then is the same idea, but just to gender identity. So it's this idea that being cisgender is the normal and preferred way of being. So a cisnormative practice would be a building that only had a men's room and a women's room. It's assuming that everybody would feel safe and comfortable and be able to use and access one of those 2 spaces when we know that's not true. Trans, non-binary folks don't always feel safe to use a bathroom because of prior experiences of people maybe questioning why they're there, maybe even being physically violent for if they access a space that others perceive them not being the right space for them. So it's really identifying these structures that sometimes are invisible to those of us that don't have these marginalized identities, to change these so that we can make sure that our tent is wide enough and our institutions are sending the messages that we really want them to send, which is that everybody that is a part of this community is seen and held and respected for the fullness of who they are. At the same time, as we think about institutional change, we understand that this is a process and it's not going to happen overnight, especially if we want this change to be sustainable. We really need to make sure we're meeting communities where they're at, meeting your community where you're at, where they're at, and to move forward on a pace of change that is sustainable and has buy-in from the whole community. What's challenging about that, of course, is that there are real lives on the line and real impacts to people's quality of life when we move too quickly. And that's a really hard thing to hold into balance. And for me, that's something I try to lift up when I'm working with institutions, is I understand the different stakeholders that you're trying to appease and to navigate and to balance. And I'm asking and inviting them to consider the LGBTQ young people or the LGBTQ folks in their communities as one of those same stakeholders. And the messages that we're sending, if we move slowly or if we are putting the preference on others in the community, how that might impact other people, and then understanding that there might be a cost to that. They might not want to be a part of that community anymore. You might not strive to create the type of community that you want to be a part of, or you're trying to create that's LGBTQ inclusive. And that's a real challenge of this work. And so this is a helpful framework that we have identified and used that's adapted from Teaching for Diversity and Social Justice to really think about where our communities are at and what can we do to move them along this continuum. In the work that I do, I often think about what can we do to intervene to move us from one stage to the next. And then maybe later on, we can, once those first steps are in place, to move on to the next stage. So it ranges on a spectrum, just as much we've been talking about is on a spectrum, from hostile to embracing. So hostile would be inhospitable to the presence of LGBTQ people, opposes equal treatment for LGBTQ people, takes an intimidating, antagonistic, or offensive attitude and or actions towards LGBTQ people. So this, when you think about the types of institutions this might be, these would be folks that are actively working against LGBTQ rights, and really would try to shut down any kind of discussion or movement to make the space any more tolerable for LGBTQ individuals. Moving on, we have the indifferent stage. So indifferent to or unaware of the presence of LGBTQ people, blind to the exclusion, harassment, or mistreatment of LGBTQ people, denies or ignores negative attitudes or actions towards LGBTQ people, resistant to efforts to bring LGBTQ issues to light. This would be for communities that maybe aren't outwardly hostile and they're not actively working against LGBTQ inclusion, but they maybe don't see what this has to do with them. They might think, oh, there are no LGBTQ adults in this community, so therefore there are no LGBTQ young people in this community. They might be also thinking that it's not age appropriate to discuss these issues with young people, or that it's not the place for us to talk about these identities in the public square, not realizing that for many of them that probably identify as heterosexual, that they do the same thing all the time about their sexual orientation by talking about their marriage if they're married to a member of a different sex, right? So a heterosexual couple that's openly talking about their marriage is talking about their sexual orientation. They can do that in a way that is not discussing the private, what's happening behind closed doors of their bedroom perhaps, but they're still talking about who they're attracted to and how they live their life in response to that. Gay, lesbian, bisexual, queer folks want to do the same thing and should be able to do the same thing, talking about their relationships in ways that are age appropriate and are affirming and don't always are grounded in what's happening behind closed doors. So the next stage would be the tolerant phase. So accepts the presence of LGBTQ people on the condition of silence, does not offer concrete welcome or support, recognizes negative treatment of LGBTQ people and its harmful effects, but may not take action to change the outcome or is just starting to act. So I think for me, the most useful framework of understanding this is that don't ask, don't tell type policy. When you think about the military, years ago for gay, lesbian, bisexual folks in the military, or even if you think about our Jewish institutions, I've worked with many camps and religious schools that work with young people where they will have LGBTQ staff employed, but they are not allowed to talk about their identity in public to the children. Kind of the my private life stays private. And while I understand where that's coming from, it's still denying that individual to bring their full self to that space, and for LGBTQ young people that might be struggling in silence to see a role model for them, an adult in their life that could be a role model for them moving forward in their community. Next, we have inclusive. So they welcome LGBTQ presence and participation, works to manifest characteristics of welcome through content, language, training, and visibility, supports increased awareness of LGBTQ people and their needs, speaks up against negative treatment of LGBTQ people and its harmful effects. So here we might have an institution that's really just starting to maybe get their senior staff trained, their frontline staff trained on LGBTQ 101 type trainings, maybe starting to think about holding events that speak explicitly to this topic, so perhaps a Pride Shabbat, or maybe thinking about their policies for their staff and for their larger community to make sure they're inclusive. And then lastly, the final stage is embracing. So actively seeks and values LGBTQ presence and participation as an essential component of the larger organization. Admires and nurtures the contributions of LGBTQ people to the enterprise. Advocates actions to change cultures that exclude or denigrate LGBTQ people. So this would be a community that is not only kind of working internally, but would probably also be doing some external work and advocating around LGBTQ rights more broadly. So an embracing institution might be one that has a rainbow flag or trans flag on the outside of their building so that folks know that this is a religious space that is welcome of all people, regardless of their sexual orientation or gender identity. Perhaps they are a community that that includes in their Siddur, in the life cycle section where we're talking about rituals around life cycle events, maybe they include a ritual for gender transition or coming out ceremony. That's kind of just normalized in the community, in the community's life. Maybe they're participating in pride events. Perhaps they're advocating, for example, in Massachusetts, there was the Yes on 3 campaign, and the Jewish community led by Keshet had a very large voice in that. So maybe those communities were actively engaged in these advocacy type efforts. Along the bottom, those are more individual actions that kind of map onto these types of different organizational stages, if you're curious about what it could look on a more individual level. And it's highly possible that for some of your organizations you are a part of or affiliated with, that you might be at different stages around different topics. So maybe around lesbian, gay, bisexual inclusion, you're farther along on the more inclusive embracing side of things. But for trans inclusion, non-binary, queer inclusion, perhaps you're a little bit farther behind. I think a lot of communities are that way, where they really are now kind of really wrestling and tackling and making sure that their gender identity, gender expression, inclusion practices are truly affirming of everybody in their community. So then what does this look like? What are some of the best practices related to becoming more LGBTQ inclusive? We think about this work of institutional change in 3 different buckets: programming, policy, and culture. And so I'm going to go over each of those sections in turn to give you some ideas of what that could look like. And then we'll also kind of close with some activities that you're going to be doing that you can maybe bring this home and think about, what does this mean for my home community? So one is making sure you lift up examples of queer inclusive spaces that LGBTQ Jews might not realize they have access to. So for example, Chaim in Boston really made sure that their mikvah was one that queer and trans folks felt safe and comfortable going to. In a lot of places around the country, mikvahs and other ritualistic bathing spaces are under kind of the purview of maybe a little bit more conservative voices in our community that wouldn't allow or have a safe space for trans, queer, non-binary folks to participate. So by creating these other alternative spaces that either are kind of mikvahs themselves or creating programs to take people to maybe natural bodies of water, it opens up this really spiritual part of Judaism to the queer community that might not have otherwise had access to it. The same goes for other kind of ritualistic moments too, is just making sure that we are aware of what services are provided or what are some of the services that are missing that maybe we could provide in its place, some of the gaps that are missing. Making sure you're perhaps creating groups specific for the LGBTQ community, either in a gender sexuality alliance, if you are a part of a youth space, or if you're with an elder space, maybe an LGBTQ elders group. It's important to create spaces for marginalized groups to congregate together, just because it's so exhausting to continuously navigate the world and communities where their structures are not built to support us. They're not made for us. And that takes a lot of energy and a lot of stress to consistently navigate. And so by creating these spaces, it allows LGBTQ individuals room to kind of breathe and to relax and to be with like-minded people where maybe they don't have to worry about the same types of dynamics or triggering language, misgendering that might be happening in other spaces. Thinking of ways in which you can infuse LGBTQ content into your existing Jewish programming and even create explicit LGBTQ programming. So one example, this is from the Jewish Federation and JCC in Salt Lake City. They created a community LGBTQ Passover Seder. Right, if we think about the Passover Seder and the holiday, the themes of the holiday really speak to liberation and to justice and to civil rights. That is really calls us to kind of bring in this content into the room. So perhaps throwing a Passover Seder, other Jewish holidays that really lend themselves to some queer theming are having a Pride Shabbat, for example, where you might invite a speaker from your community or from an outside group to come in and really talk about, from the Bima, LGBTQ inclusion from that Jewish perspective. Hanukkah is another great holiday that really speaks to these themes of justice and liberation. Purim also has a lot that you could play with. It could also be really challenging to have an inclusive Purim celebration just because of the nature of gender play that's sometimes going around and not in a thoughtful way. So that's something that if you have questions about, I'm happy to talk to you more about. That's another really great holiday that you could do some kind of Jewish LGBTQ programming. And then in general, outside of Jewish programming, there's all kinds of other types of programs you could do. Perhaps host a film festival that has a Jewish LGBTQ theme, invite a speaker, an art exhibit. You could mark either in your community or on social media days of observance of holidays and of mourning that are very specific to the LGBTQ community. We often think of June during Pride Month in many places around the country as that time to do some of this programming, but June is not the only time, and it's important to spread it out throughout the year so it's not all happening in June. October is another really great month that lends itself to a high programming around this theme. October is LGBTQ History Month. National Coming Out Day happens that month, Spirit Day. There's also Transgender Day of Remembrance in November, World AIDS Day in December, and the Transgender Day of Visibility in March. There's Harvey Milk Day as well, who was first openly gay man elected to public office in the United States. He also was Jewish. So lots of really great holidays that you can, and observances that you can really start to infuse in your calendar. We've talked a lot about creating specific groups. So considering creating this Jewish LGBTQ Pride group so that folks can do things together, create programming for the community, for both LGBTQ Jews, but also for the community at large. Another part of programming that we would sometimes think about is frontline staff programming, or frontline training. So frontline staff would be anybody that is interacting with your constituents or any stakeholders that are not staff. So students, clients, if you're working at a JCC, people that might be coming in to use your facilities, congregants, right? If the first person they interact with, or anybody they could interact with, so this would be office workers, maintenance, security, making sure that they are trained on LGBTQ inclusion, and they're not using gendered language, they're not making assumptions about people, just making sure that they are culturally competent. Because if somebody were to try to gain access to your synagogue, be a new member, and their first interaction with the office worker was negative, they're probably not going to want to come back. So this is just a few of the policy, programming ideas, excuse me. In the inclusion guides that you have as assigned reading, you'll see a lot more in-depth review of what that could look like. And now I want to talk about policy. So we've talked a lot about values early on in our time together. Just here are some of those, the 7 Jewish values again. And for me, it's helpful to think about policy as a codification of our values. It's putting to paper and putting into practice what is it that we value as a community. So making sure that all of your policies are explicit in naming that this is a space that is welcoming and inclusive and affirming of LGBTQ individuals. So at any point, if you are in any policy enumerating other identities like race, religion, socioeconomic status, you need to explicitly state sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression. Here we have, this is a policy from a camp. You'll see camp is always a really tricky gendered space. Here we have a policy that they wrote on what campers can expect in terms of discussing and expressing their gender identity, how they would contact people if somebody were to come out of camp, things of that nature. So really thinking about the full experience that somebody could be having and coming up with policies and protocols to make sure you are ready if that were to happen. Here we have a Temple Israel of the City of New York, a gender inclusive statement that really talks about their desire to create a community that supports a teen's journey of self-discovery, that really struggles with this idea of housing, that opens up the possibility for people to talk about where they feel comfortable with housing for an overnight program, for example. Here we have Rabbis for Human Rights Non-Discrimination Policy. Again, kind of you'll see an example of enumerating qualities, enumerating identities out as being really important. The same would go for equal opportunity employment policy. Again, here's a diversity statement, a statement of inclusive of who we strive to be. We welcome all regardless of, and kind of listing everything out. This all helps kind of create the culture that we're working towards of a LGBTQ inclusive space. So culture is kind of the makeup of the institution. It's how we sell ourselves. It's how we talk about ourselves. It's the messages that we send. Again, just some values language to help guide you in how we think about this and the types of culture that we want to cultivate. But really putting up visible markers of inclusion is really important. Bathrooms in particular are something that can be really challenging for folks. So putting up signs near their bathrooms for folks to use the restroom that it fits their gender identity or expression. Making sure you have an all-gender bathroom available with signage, appropriate signage too. I prefer to avoid any signs that have kind of the stick figures and instead prefer those signs that just tell you what's in the room. Putting up other symbols of inclusion, the 7 Jewish values, we have a poster version of it that you could put up. Putting up other statements, explicit statements of support for trans Jews in particular, non-binary Jews. That's again a poster that we have that you could order. What types of resources do you have in your media library, in your media resource section? The Purim Superhero and the Flower Girl Rustler are just 2. Those are both Jewish LGBTQ books. I Am Jazz, My Princess Boy. These are only just a few examples, and if you want to know more, this is something that Keshet is able to provide a list of additional resources for you. So that was a very brief overview because much of the best practices that you're going to go over can be found in the inclusion guides that I'm going to ask you to go through based on the one that best fits the institutions you're a member of. And so what I would like you to do this week for your final assignments are in the discussion forum, think about what is in your sphere of influence that you have the ability to impact. What stage of inclusion are they? What values are present in the community that connect to LGBTQ inclusion and how? And then your assignment is to pick an institution you are affiliated with. I'd then like you to complete the institutional self-assessment that is in your course. It'll just be a series of questions to see what currently exists around LGBTQ inclusion and what maybe does not. So that'll identify the gaps, so that then you can write a 1 to 2 page reflection on how would you use a values-based framework to move towards greater LGBTQ inclusion. Be sure to include what strategies you want to move on and how you'd approach that conversation. Again, just getting those initial thoughts of how you would start approaching these types of conversations to move towards greater LGBTQ inclusion. So as always, please email me if you have any questions, and I look forward to reading your responses. And I've just been really grateful for you all to be in this course with me. I hope you learned a great deal. So thank you so much.